Hey, good afternoon. So what I'm going to be talking about is very different in terms of the timing of these phenomena. Instead of, as we've just heard about in the last two excellent talks, instead of talking about what are the predictors long-term of suicidal behavior and suicide deaths, I'm going to be focusing on what are the near-term, and I mean in terms of hours, predictors of not attempts, not necessarily self-harm behavior, but more the urges as these fluctuate over time. Okay, so quite different shift here. So proximal risk factors. They're defined as near-term predictors. They're immediate precipitants or triggers. They occur near in time to an outcome as opposed to being a distal or a static risk factor. They're often dynamic. Things like affective states, interpersonal interactions, contextual factors, substance use. And because they're so dynamic, they're usually very modifiable, right? But we need to know what to assess and among whom, and where do we intervene. So, so that's the goal of looking at these proximal risk factors. There aren't a lot of studies thus far that have been able to look at these proximal risk factors for self-harm or suicide behavior. There's new methods out now. Of course, experience sampling has really taken off as a great way to look at this. As far as theory goes, Joyner's interpersonal psychological theory, I think, is applicable here. There are other theories that are as well, but this one talks about thwarted belongingness and perceived burdensomeness as two of the factors that may be near-term predictors of increases in, at least in suicidal ideation. Okay, and thwarted belongingness involves a feeling of disconnectedness, a social rejection, exclusion, abandonment, severe social loss, those sorts of things. And perceived burdensomeness can be thought of as both a sense of worthlessness and shame, a deep sense of shame, and also perceived liability on others. That others would be better off without me. But most of the studies on these constructs have been cross-sectional in nature. So far, the intensive longitudinal assessments studies that have been done looking at near-term predictors of self-harm or suicidal thoughts or behaviors have been able to identify components, though, of these of this model that seem to emerge as predictors of increases in self-harm thoughts or behaviors. So interpersonal stressors, including perceived rejection, as well as negative emotions, especially shame-based emotions, sense of worthlessness, and also sadness and anxiety. So sort of internalizing affects. But what we haven't seen yet is a lot of work on how are these linked with each other. What might be the within-person processes as they unfold over time in very short intervals. So, one hypothesis is that when an individual perceives feeling rejected, excluded, or abandoned, that they may experience an increase in negative affect, but particularly if maybe they're very sensitive to rejection, so there's individual differences in that as well. One could think of this as social threat dysregulation, maybe in an RDoC framework, but this sort of reactivity or sensitivity to feeling rejected may in turn predict self-injurious thoughts and behaviors. So perceived rejection or exclusion, thwarted belongingness may not be directly related. It may have more to do with how one reacts to that. So in this study, and this is preliminary data, by the way. This is an ongoing study. It's been going on for about 1.5 years now, and so very preliminary. But we wanted to examine the near-term predictors of suicide and self-harm related thoughts and behaviors in daily life. And we're using intensive longitudinal assessment here. We're using Ecological Momentary Assessment. And we're focusing on within individual dynamic processes, particularly interpersonal stressors and affective responses, although we assessed a number of other factors and looked at those as well, as you'll see. Our first hypothesis was that within-person increases, and I mean relative to someone's own average levels, so we're talking about deviations around one's kind of trait level across time, how those increases would predict likelihood of self-injurious thoughts and behaviors at the next time point. So we would have expected that rejection or exclusion at time t-1 within the same day would predict an increase in self-injurious thought or behavior at the next time point. Second, we predicted that increase in negative affect within an individual, especially internalizing negative affects related to shame, sadness, and anxiety, would be associated with near-term subsequent increases in self-injurious thoughts and behaviors. And third, we looked at whether perceived rejection was indirectly associated with self-injurious thoughts and behaviors via a change in negative affect after controlling for negative affect at the last time point. So here we're trying to explicate a within-person process model and an indirect or mediation effect. Okay, so sample is quite different than what we've seen in the last two talks. This is a sample of young women only, ages 19 to 24. They were recruited from the Pittsburgh Girls Study, and I know we've presented a lot of data from the Pittsburgh Girls Study over the years at this conference, so some of you are probably familiar with them. What I think is important to take away here is that this is a very high-risk community sample. It's an urban sample that's been oversampled from low-income areas in the city of Pittsburgh. And so although it's a community sample and it's a non-clinical sample, what you'll see in a minute is that they have a very high risk, and that so it's a community sample, and it's non-clinical, but it is certainly not a healthy sample. In order to be included in this analysis, the participants had to have self-injurious thoughts or behaviors within the past month, and that's so that we could capture this very low base rate behavior within our sampling frame. Also different than most clinical samples, this is a mostly African-American sample, and 56% were receiving government public assistance. So we conducted a thorough clinical assessment at intake into the study. This is a longitudinal study. We're conducting follow-ups at 6 months and 12 months currently. I'm only presenting baseline data today. The most common diagnoses that we've found with our semi-structured clinical interviews are personality disorder. 42% had a personality disorder. Most of the personality disorders we see in the sample is BPD. The second most common is antisocial personality disorder at 10%, and the third was avoidant personality disorder at about 8%. All personality disorders, though, were represented in the sample to some degree. 31% had current major depressive disorder, almost 30% had cannabis use disorder, and 26% had current PTSD. So again, it's a very high-risk sample. 95% had lifetime suicide ideation, and 44% had a lifetime suicide attempt. And 58% had lifetime NSSI behavior. And in order to be included, again, they had to have had at least one of these, even just ideation, within the past month. So our EMA protocol consists of 21 days of smartphone surveys. There were 7 daily prompts, 1 morning assessment approximately when the participant wakes up in the morning, and then 6 random assessments throughout their waking hours. On average, we had 112 observations per person. And what I'm going to present today is the within-person effects. So I'm focusing on level 1 for those of you who understand multi-level models. I'm focusing on within individual effects within days. So we've dropped any of the time-lagged variables that occurred on the day prior. And so on average then we have assessments that are about 2 hours apart, but the modal and median assessment lags are about 1 to 1.5 hours apart, so very, very close together in time. We assessed since the last prompt urges for NSSI, very low base rate of reporting in general, but you would expect that with any sample. And actually, I've looked at this within clinical samples, and we've seen similar rates of endorsement, if not lower, because those samples weren't recruited based on past month self-injurious thoughts and behaviors. But in 2.2% of the observations, we see it, and in 44% of persons across the entire 3 weeks of assessment, we see it. Urges for suicide are a little less common at 1% of observations, 28% of persons, and then even less common were threats of self-harm or suicide and intentional self-harm actions. So, imperfect, but we collapsed these outcomes into one, and we looked at whether on any given occasion an individual endorsed any self-injurious thought or behavior, including these 4 items. And so this occurred in 56% of persons and in 2.6% of observations. And the other domains we assessed included sleep problems, substance use, intoxication, and risky sex, what they were doing and who they were with, and what their moods were like in the last 15 minutes. And according to multi-level factor analysis, these were grouped into 3 domains: externalizing negative affect, anger and hostility; internalizing negative affect, which included items for shame, guilt, sadness, loneliness, and anxiety; and positive affect. We assessed whether the individual felt rejected, excluded, abandoned, or left out since the last prompt, whether they felt insulted or criticized, and whether they felt complimented or praised. And then this gives you an idea of what our most basic univariate model might look like, this is one where we looked at the momentary rating of perceived rejection, exclusion, abandonment, or feeling left out at time t minus 1, but it's person mean centered. So we're taking out the person's average, and we're looking at deviations around that. Rejection predicting the likelihood, because this is a multi-level logistic regression model, the likelihood of self-injurious thought and behavior at time t, after controlling for the person's mean level across time. So first we conducted univariate models to see which ones on their own which of our variables were predictors of a SITB likelihood at the next time prompt. Feeling rejected, feeling insulted or criticized, decrease in positive affect, within person increases in externalizing negative affect, so anger, and internalizing negative affect, so shame, sadness, anxiety. All of these were significant in univariate models in predicting likelihood of SITB at the next prompt. Sleep problems, being alone or with others, alcohol use, drug use, intoxication, risky sex, complimented or praised. None of these factors were predictive of likelihood of SITB at the next prompt, nor were the ones other than sleep problems, which was only assessed on a daily basis. The other factors weren't even associated with SITB at the same time frame. So that's interesting in and of itself. But then we grouped the interpersonal factors that were significant in the univariate models together in a multivariate model, looked at feeling rejected and feeling insulted or criticized at the same time, and only feeling rejected, excluded, abandoned, or left out was predictive. And among the moods, only the internalizing negative affect, not anger and not the decrease in positive affect, predicted an increase in likelihood of SITB at the next time point. And then finally, we tested this within-person process model, in which we wanted to look at change in internalizing negative affect as the mediator. And let me go back if I can. And what we did find, consistent with our prediction, was that when you put both perceived rejection and internalizing negative affect in the model, that the direct effect of perceived rejection on likelihood of SITB at the next time point becomes non-significant, and you see a direct effect of perceived rejection on change in internalizing negative affect, that's controlling for the negative affect at the last time point, and then that change in negative affect predicts greater likelihood of SITB at the next time point. And there's a significant indirect effect there. 53% of the effect of rejection on SITB was mediated by a change in internalizing negative affect. So we found that SITBs are more likely to occur immediately following increases in perceived rejection, but not after feeling criticized. And also immediately following increases in negative affect, but especially shame, sadness, anxiety, and loneliness, not anger or a decrease in positive affect when you're controlling for all of those at the same time. But we also find that the effect of rejection is mediated by an increase in negative affect. So I think this suggests that, this is consistent with, I think, what Lois was saying yesterday, too, about, where to lean in. Where might we try to intervene in order to prevent someone from going down that path to despair and then to suicidal or self-harming action. And it's perhaps when they start to feel that sense of disconnection, when they feel rejected, when they feel abandoned, and particularly if they're having a strong reaction to that. And one of the things that I did find that I didn't include here because it's so preliminary, but that BPD symptoms actually predicted a stronger negative affect reaction to rejection in this in this sample so far. It's probably that interpersonal sensitivity that we need to be focused on. There are a lot of limitations here. We're assessing mostly urges for NSSI in this outcome, and in these preliminary data, mostly what we see are just thoughts about injuring themselves or thoughts about suicide. Very few actual behaviors occurred in that 3-week window. And even with longitudinal models like this, and even if you control for the last time point, you still have limits in how you can interpret the data as causal. We need to be doing cross-lagged regression, time series models, and when you have a low base rate outcome and sparse data, that can be difficult to do. And also there's some limits of the sample, may not be quite representative of what you see in practice, and we can't generalize to males. So next steps are to conduct a similar kind of study, but in a higher risk, in a mixed gender clinical sample, and to attempt some longer intensive longitudinal follow-up. So I would welcome anyone to come talk with me later if you have ideas about ways to do this. One thing that would be very interesting is to try to conduct assessment bursts, I think, whenever we see, based on, some lower frequency assessments, whenever we see an increase in negative thinking, or we see an increase in interpersonal problems, or some kind of marker, and maybe even if we could have an algorithm that learns over time when somebody's risk is starting to increase, and then we start to assess more intensively. But how to do that, I'm not quite sure yet. So we also need to conduct some more comprehensive assessment of SITBs than what we did in this sample, including implicit suicide and death-related thoughts and passive suicide ideation. We did not assess that here. And so I think an exciting other direction is to use mobile sensors and wearable technology and get beyond self-reports. We can get things like, how people are sleeping and how much they're moving around, and even how much they're talking with their social networks and engaging with other people. So there's a lot that we can learn from that. And I want to thank the participants of the Pittsburgh Girls Study and all of my collaborators and team members and our funding sources.